Thank you so much for the introduction, and once again thank you for the organizing committee for having me here in this wonderful venue and in wonderful Sicily. Indeed, we are talking about the Senning operation and the mustard operation. We have been talking about operative issues, about exercise capacity, and indeed what to expect on the quality of life of the patients so many years after the operation. It is shortly after lunch, and maybe you are having some postprandial somnolence, and therefore I start with the conclusion. So if you are in need for an afternoon nap, you already got that. First conclusion: quality of life in patients following the mustard and the Senning operation is well studied. However, the studies did not always use rigorous methodologies. When assessed holistically, then the quality of life of the patients is good and equal to that of the general population. However, when quality of life is approached from a functional perspective, then we see that adult patients do worse than controls, whereas children do better than controls. And finally, physical functioning and general health following arterial switch operation seems to be better than after the atrial redirection, being the Senning and the mustard. Please give me some time to explain how I come to these conclusions. And let's go back to 1974. This is the moment that the first study on, or the first report on quality of life in congenital heart disease has been published. It was a paper from Charlotte Ference. It was not an empirical study, but it was a report on a new evolving topic, being long life aspects in our patients. So she wanted to raise attention for this aspect of quality of life in that, at that moment for the adolescent cardiac patients. Of course, since 1974 and today, a lot has happened. And it was some years ago that we did a review on all the quality of life studies that have been published since 1974. So a review of 40 years of quality of life research in congenital heart disease. Overall, we were able to identify 234 articles. And as you can see on this figure, the number of articles that were published every year on quality of life in congenital heart disease really grow exponentially. And if we want to know what are the heart defects that have been studied in these 234 studies, then it looks like this. About half of the studies have included a mix of patients, a mix of heart defects. It was a combination of different heart defects included in the study. The most frequently studied condition or heart defect was transposition of the great arteries. Overall, 26 of the 234 studies pertained transposition of the great arteries. So I use this as the basis for the presentation of today. If we dig into the details of these 26 patients, we see that 9 of these patients pertain to patients after a mustard and a Senning operation, 6 after arterial switch. 3 studies had a combination of either mustard Senning or arterial switch operations. 5 studies as mustard and Senning and congenitally corrected transposition. 2 studies only the congenital corrected transposition, and 1 study did not report which kind of condition or which kind of treatment was included. So, mustard and Senning, 9 studies. The first study out of these 9 was published in 1981, and the last study was published in 2007. more than a decade ago. And of course, this represents the interest that was going to the mustard and the Senning operation. The first study that was really on the high days of the Senning operation, shortly after the switch from mustard to Senning operation. And the last study in 2007 is far beyond the moment that mustard and Senning has been abandoned. And it clearly shows, like Alessandro started his presentation, that nowadays people that are trained today do not see mustard and Senning operations, and clearly researchers are also no longer interested in the mustard and Senning operations. At least not to dedicate specific attention in their research to that. So, let's then look at what are the instruments that has been used in these 9 studies. Well, 4 studies did not report how they assessed quality of life. And that's problematic because then you do not know how to interpret the data. They draw conclusions in terms of quality of life, but you don't know how they get there. So from a conceptual, from a methodological point of view, that's a problem. Other studies used either the NIA classification, one health status item, socio-demographics. For instance, if you are married, then you are having a good quality of life. That was actually the conclusion that these researchers were making. Another study combined the ability index and the SF36, and another study combined the Taqwal linear analog scale and the satisfaction with life scale. It's clear that from these studies that do not report which instrument that they have used, and the NIA classification, one item, health status, social demographics, we do not learn a lot about the quality of life of our patients. And therefore, for this presentation, I would like to focus on these 2 studies that included either the SF36 or the Taqwal linear analog scale and satisfaction with life scale. The study that used the SF36 was the one from Ibbenroad and colleagues published in 2007, entitled Long-Term Functional Outcome of Patients Following the Mustard Procedure. And this is one of the figures in the study. What they did was they compared the data from their study with an original study, and we will not dig into these details, but they also compared it with population norms and with other populations of sick patients. Because, as I told you this morning as well, when we are comparing with the general population, that does not mean that we are comparing with healthy people. Because in the general population, there are people with other medical conditions, and therefore it is interesting to either split it up in healthy person or to do what these investigators did, compare it with people with other medical conditions. And these are the data from the mustard group, indicated in pink here. And if these data are compared with population norms, the general population, then it could be seen that there was a statistically significant difference regarding physical functioning, energy, and the general health. That in that way, that patients after a mustard and Senning operation did worse than patients or people from the general population. However, when these results are compared with other sick populations, for most of these dimensions, no significant difference was found, except for role limitations. There, the people after the mustard and Senning scored much better than people with other medical conditions, which is kind of indicative that people after such an operation still can perform the roles in life that they want to perform. Another study came from Belgium. It was the data from 4 Belgian centers that I combined, and we looked at that time at the health status, functional abilities and quality of life of all patients that were known in Belgium and were still alive at that time. And we included 89 patients in this study. First, we used a linear analog scale, which is a very easy way. It's a scale from 0 to 100, and you indicate in one number how good or bad do you appraise your quality of life. And this is actually what the results in our study showed. The median age, the median score on linear analog scale was 80, which is pretty high if you see from 0 to 100. Regarding satisfaction with life, the score was 27 on a scale ranging from 5 to 35. So this also indicates that they are pretty satisfied with their life. If they have to consider the life that they are leading, the life that they are living, they're pretty satisfied with how that goes. Of course, the question is, how does this reflect, or how does this correspond with data from healthy population? And this is what we did in afterwards and expressed in this figure. We matched our patients to people, to healthy people from the general population, and we matched them on age and gender, and also civil state, I think. And we calculated the mean standardized differences, which means that the control group, the healthy people, are corresponding with 0. And the scores that we see here, if they are higher, that means, or if they are positive, that means that the scores of the patients are higher. If the score is negative, that means that the score of the patients is lower than that of the general population. And you see here, the score is higher. It was not statistically significant. Probably this is explained by the fact that we only had 89 patients, so the sample was not very big. But what is most interesting for us is not necessarily if it is statistically significant or not, it is the effect size. How big is this difference? And irrespective of the fact that it is not statistically significant, it is not we cannot neglect the difference. The difference can be considered small, but still not neglectable. Then the TAQUAL was another instrument that was used in this study. And I explained this morning as well, the TAQUAL is an instrument developed in the Netherlands. We made the top 10 list of the most problematic issues in these patients. And if we look at the top 5 of this, worrying about one's health, that was the most dominant aspect for them. Number 1, followed by feeling that the body is less capable than one would wish, experiencing limitations in doing fun activities with the children, worrying about future job, or about a job and a future job, and worrying about one's working life. So, irrespective of the fact that they are satisfied with their life and that they consider their life situation, quality of life very good, of course they are concerned about certain aspects. And the future is clearly something that is in their minds. And we should not neglect this. Okay, these were the studies conducted in mustard and Senning patients. What is also interesting is that we also look at mustard and Senning patients compared with arterial switch operations. And like I said earlier on, 3 studies did this kind of comparison. The first study came from a collaborative group in the United States, and they looked at the quality of life of children with transposition, either mustard Senning or arterial switch operation. Children, then it is interesting to know what is the age, what we are talking about. The mean age in this study was 13.1 years of age. And this is one of the figures in this study. The study used the Child Health Questionnaire, which is actually comparative with the SF36, but the SF36 is meant for adults. The Child Health Questionnaire is meant for children. And the transposition group was compared with the published norms. And this comparison showed that for all the factors except for self-esteem, patients are doing better than controls. It is contrasting with what we found in adults, but these are children, and apparently the parents see that their children are doing pretty well. Secondly, this study also compared the situation between arterial switch operation, atrial redirection, and Rastelli. And they found that in terms of physical functioning, bodily pain, general health perception, self-esteem, and mental health, patients after arterial switch operation are having higher scores than after the atrial redirection. So after arterial switch, patients are doing better than after mustard or Senning. No differences were seen in terms of behavior, social limits, or family activities and family cohesion. One tricky thing, and that's also said in the previous presentation, these patients in general have different ages. So is corrected for age in this study? No, it's not. We need to bear this in mind that we are comparing two different age groups as well. Another study came from Germany, published in 2011. And what I said about the differences in age, these investigators clearly showed that there was an age difference. So the arterial switch patients had a mean age of 17, and the mustard Senning patients had a mean age of 24 here. And the results look like this. Overall, patients with a mustard and Senning operation are doing a little bit better than patients after an arterial switch, but it is not statistically significant, so we could neglect this. Has this to do with methodological differences, the fact that there is an age difference? Has this to do with the fact that the group is too small to reach statistical significance? We don't know. So that's what these results showed. The third study, where mustard and Senning and arterial switch operation patients are compared, is coming from the Munich group. And I have to say, methodologically wise, this is actually the best study, because they matched patients from the two groups based on age and on gender. And therefore, the age difference is 0.1 year. So we can neglect that. What is the problem, the methodological problem in the other studies? That's solved by this matching procedure in this study. So this is really contributing to the validity of the results here. And what did these investigators find? In terms of physical functioning and in terms of general health, patients after arterial switch do better, statistically significant better than the Senning patients, irrespective of the fact that they are still small sample sizes. And for the other factors, there was no statistically significant difference. Again, we could wonder if this has to do with the small sample sizes, but here we are talking about a p-value of 0.7, 0.569. We will never get this statistically significant, even with bigger samples. So, once again, this is probably the most valid study when comparing mustard Senning operation patients with arterial switch, due to the matching. So, let's go back to the overall situation. The 26 studies on mustard and Senning, 9 of them specifically mustard Senning, 3 of them comparing it with arterial switch. For the focus of this presentation, I will not deal with arterial switch because this is what I discussed this morning, and I will not deal with the congenital corrected transposition because yes, you can put them in the same group when it comes about when we are talking about the ventricle, about the systemic ventricle, but of course there are other issues that play a role here, and therefore it would not be fair to put them in the same equation. So, coming back to my conclusions, quality of life in patients following a mustard and a Senning operation is indeed well studied. It's the most frequently studied condition within the area of quality of life in congenital heart disease. However, they are not always using rigorous methodologies, and therefore the conclusions are quite often hampered as well. We cannot draw firm conclusions based on study results. When quality of life is assessed holistically from a satisfaction of life point of view, we can see that indeed their quality of life is pretty good and equal and even sometimes higher than that of the general population. But when you approach it from a functional perspective, of course these people do have some functional limitations. And we clearly show that adults then are doing worse than controls, but when you are looking at children after such an operation, they are generally doing better. Of course, future research will show if we can confirm the findings so far. And finally, physical functioning and general health status after the arterial switch operation seem to be better than after the mustard and the Senning operation. Thank you so much.